So, to get an understanding of why so much Asian guys and girls well off into their 30s still live with their parents, because I don't know about you guys, but my parents came from the motherland, the Vietnam, right? And they grew up in the 50s and 60s during the war. And when you're born in Asia, you don't really have anyone to help you out. So what do? You have a lot of kids. And in Vietnam, I'm not sure about other Southeast Asian countries, is that within one Vietnamese household, you have like a family of 10 to 11 kids. And that was no different for my own mom and dad. And you're expected to take care of your parents, to help them out, to live with them until their very last breath. And since my parents immigrated from Vietnam to Vancouver, that's pretty much been the mentality that they've taken with them. And for the majority of my life, I grew up with or lived in the same household with my grandma, my grandpa, and my aunt. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. I know there's other Asian kids out there who actually live with their grandma, their grandpa, their aunt, or someone of their relative. Because within Asian families is that you're expected to take care of whoever and be within the same household. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of Asian kids grow up not moving out until they're married and have kids. And even in Vietnam, if you get married and you have kids, there's still a slight chance that you still live with your mom and dad when they're 50 and 60 years old and you're like 40 something and having a kid. And it's not that uncommon. But when you move back here into the more of the Western mentality, it kind of gives a bad taste on people, because in America or Canada, you know, when you're 18 or 19, you seem to like move out and get away from your family and you come off as more independent. But you know, that may or may not be true depending on your own situation. But I've already talked about in my first video. But this video is gonna be talking about my experiences growing up with a lot of family members, even though I didn't have a lot of family members. See, growing up poor, I remember a lot of stories of where I grew up in a family of 4 in a 1-bedroom apartment. And during that time, there was a crucial moment where I haven't told a lot of people this, but my 1-bedroom apartment where my dad slept on the floor, well, the neighbors got in some kind of altercation with the landowner, and that person decided to light their apartment on fire. And guess whose apartment was right next to that? Yeah. So what ended up happening is that my family had to go within the same complex to the other apartment where my grandma, my grandpa, and my aunt stayed. And it was essentially another 1-bedroom apartment. But this time, it was my mom and dad and me and my little brother within cramped in this little apartment. So it was essentially 8 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. And I have a lot of these child stories where I remember just me, my mom, my dad laying on the floor with the blanket over us and seeing fire alarms go off in this really sketchy apartment that we lived in, this really run-down apartment. I remember people screaming in the hallways, random people knocking on our doors. And there was even one point where we didn't have a place to stay, and we had to stay in like this random, really cheap hotel because the very fact that I didn't have a home for a brief moment in my time. And another thing when it comes to growing up in Asian households and living with your parents that people don't understand is that I'm grateful because I got to live with my grandparents since I was in the 3rd grade. So when I was around 7 to like 13. And the thing about that is I got to see my grandparents from, you know, when they're well, at the same time getting to see their passing away, seeing them wither and get old and weak and eventually die. And it gives you a lot of perspective in life. When you take the negative perspective of like, oh, I live with these circumstances, I can't change anything. If anything, I'm grateful. Even though at times I go crazy, I remember this one specific moment where I was studying for my finals, and at that time I still lived with my grandma. And suddenly while I was studying, I heard this loud crash. This loud, like something like dropped. So I ran downstairs, and then I opened the door to my basement, and I saw my grandma laying there unconscious. And for me to process that, that was tough, right? But luckily, you know, she opened her eyes and I had to pick her up with my two hands and put her onto the couch that we had. And I had to go and call 911. And this didn't only happen once or twice, but it happened 3 times. And I've known my grandma or lived with my grandma since I was a kid. And they were the ones who, my grandpa and my grandma, took care of me or babysat me when my parents had to go to work when I was really young. And to see someone that's within your immediate family to go from going super well to slowly to wither away, to eventually live in a nursing home, to not have the ability to walk or feed yourself, you know, it's sad. But that's the reality of everything, of life and having perspective. And because of my situation and how I live with my parents, and I have that mentality of literally giving up everything for them, is that I'm grateful for life. To have the ability for me to see life from someone who's you thought was gonna live forever, because we think or we live in the mentality that we live forever, but truth is we die, some sooner than later, some with old age. And cliche as it sounds, nothing lasts forever. And I wanted to show and share those moments in my life, these fragile moments in my pieces of my life that I remember because I lived with my parents. And I'm sure there's a lot of other Asian kids that can relate to these stories, maybe not to my extent, maybe even a worse extent, but something that always got to me was gratitude and grateful I am, because it's all about perspective. And just because you live one way in your life doesn't mean someone sees life in that same lens. And at the same time, you know, once I had the financial backing, once I'm solidified in where I want to go, I will have independence. I'm gonna buy my own house and get my own space. But for now, you know, I'm all about family. Even though the word itself means more, I'm all about family. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Deuces.